Okay, guys, Mr. Morley here coming to you live from room 317 in the high school. Got in here, got my mask in the classroom now safely, so I wanted to reach out to you guys to see how you're doing. First of all, hopefully everything's going well. I know these are some tough times. It's different for everybody at home, but I know personally with my boys at home, it's crazy. And every day is an adventure. And apologize up to this point if I haven't been consistent on when I'm providing work to you guys and providing information. But from here going forward, I'm going to try to set it up like this. On Mondays, I'm going to put out a video or some sort of content for you to kind of watch or brush up on. And then Wednesday there'll be a follow-up assignment. So really, it's just 2 things per week. Nothing crazy, but it'll be like that for the next month or so. I have a couple notes down here. Today I'm just going to talk about a guy who probably is the most influential leader of the 20th century, arguably. His name's Mohandas Gandhi. I got my notes right here in front of me on the computer. You notice the background is just the field here, which everything is shut down. But so this period that we're at in history now is called decolonization and nationalism. So I know we talked about nationalism in communist China and how they formed a new communist regime under Mao Zedong and his plans to try to change the country, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And then briefly over this we talked about Deng Xiaoping. So that's kind of the nationalist part, and hopefully you kind of understand why China is the way they are today. In this same time period, there's a lot of decolonization going on. So we talked about imperialism, right, where one nation takes over another nation for many different reasons, mostly economic, but some social. We talked about the white man's burden and how just some of these European nations felt they had this duty to civilize the uncivilized. So this took place all over the world: Africa, China, with spheres of influences, and India. So we're going to talk about really the process of how India got their independence, right? Decolonization. So the leader of this movement was Mohandas Gandhi. And the way I'm going to talk about him is how the Regents does, or the former Regents anyway, whenever they had an essay about him, which would be like one every 2 years, right? There'd be an opportunity to write about Gandhi. And they usually ask 3 questions, right? First is historical circumstances. So what was going on in India at the time that allowed this person to, attempt to change the country? All right, so I'm going to talk about that first. Then I'm going to talk about what was his idea, or her idea. In this case, it's his. What was his ideas? How did he go about trying to change India? And then the third part is, did he do it? What type of change happened in India or any other place? That's kind of how the Regents asked it. It's weird looking at me in a screen. I've got a hat on here, which is the luxury of taking a video, cover up my bald head. Okay, so historical circumstances, again, this is the process. We remember that Great Britain took over India. This is about the mid-1700s, right, with the British East India Company, and it was primarily economic reasons for the first part of it. Eventually, India becomes the crown jewel of the British Empire, right, their most prized colony. And they took advantage of them in a lot of different ways. Slowly, the people of India, obviously, now there's about 1 billion people in India, which is the second largest populated country. At the time, not that many, but it was still a massively populated country, but they were disjointed. They weren't united, and that happens for a while, about 150 years, until we get to about World War I. Excuse me, and a lot of Indians fight and die for Great Britain in World War I. Right, and what Great Britain did in this was they promised the Indian people, hey, if you fight for us, we're going to give you some rights. We're going to it'll be an agreement here that if you fight, we'll give you something back. That really didn't happen. And so there started to be some protests, and the people were, obviously upset for this. And really the turning point in this process of decolonization for the Indian people was called the Amritsar Massacre in 1919. Notice that's the year that World War One ends. In Amritsar, a little bit like Tiananmen Square that we just talked about, people peacefully protesting in the city of Amritsar because of this forced conscription or this draft that they had for the war. You know, the government, the British government said, hey, you can't do this. We don't want you to protest. And, people kept doing it. And the British under General Dyer ended up opening fire on the crowds. They killed about 400 people, wounded 1,200 men, women, children. Oh, wow, it just got really dark in here because the lights turned off. I'm going to try to move around so that they go back on. Hold on one second. There we go, I'm back. But anyway, it was a horrible, horrible event, but it changed. It was a turning point in Indians demanding independence. And this is where Gandhi comes into play. If you've never heard of Gandhi, which I hope you have, his nickname was the Great Soul. He comes about in the 20s and 30s. He's actually from a fairly wealthy Indian family. He's trained as a barrister, which is a barrister, as a lawyer, essentially. He gets trained in Britain. So he's, fluent in English. He's very educated. On his way he did some work in South Africa originally. On his way back on a train, he had a first-class ticket, and there was no, colored people allowed to be in first class. And he was kicked off the train for saying, hey, this isn't right. So that was kind of his event that allowed him to get ideas of, hey, why are things this way? And I want to do something about it. He wants to unite, first of all Indians, rich, poor, Hindu and Muslim, which if you remember, those are the two main religions in India, are Hindu and Muslim people. Hindu for the majority of the people there, and Muslim ends up splitting the country later on. We'll talk about that later. But he has an idea of how to fight the British without fighting, okay? Nonviolent protest. He calls it satyagraha, which means soul force. He uses civil disobedience, which hopefully you've heard of that before. It's the refusal to obey an unjust law, right? And this doesn't come, if you say to your mom or dad tonight, I'm not going to make my bed, I'm practicing civil disobedience. That's not civil disobedience, right? It has to be unjust. So a law is there, yes, but it's, not a good one. It's not, I'm not getting my human rights, as you go back to John Locke. And so that was one of the ways he did this. And he did it in a multitude of ways. One was boycott. They would boycott British goods that were made. Cloth, a lot of it was made in Great Britain and sold to the Indian people. He started a movement called the homespun movement, which, allowed people to just make their own clothes and stuff like that. Gandhi changed his clothes. Traditionally he's seen in this Indian sort of gown, right? The cloth and stuff like that. But originally he was dressed as a lawyer in British and Western clothes. So that was, one way they protested, was not buying British goods. He went on hunger strikes all the time. If he didn't like something that was going on in India, if there was fighting between Hindus and Muslims, he would just not eat. And if you or I did that, I don't know how much awareness we would get, but Gandhi was so revered by his people that, when he didn't eat, people didn't want him to die. And so he changed things just by fasting. And the nonviolence really stopped when he did these things. He again, nonviolent civil disobedience is his idea. And if we're going back to historical circumstances I covered with decolonization and Britain controlling India, and now this is his idea, nonviolent protest. He rejects the caste system as well as another part of his idea. Right? If you remember back to the caste system, it was, you had the untouchables at the bottom, which were people that were just kind of seen as not human, below the social class ladder. And he just didn't see this as right. He saw everybody as equal. under God, and he really fought to get the caste system removed. It's still practiced in some places in India, but it's outlawed, and he was a big part of getting that removed. His kind of biggest achievement and his kind of symbolic protest movement was called the Salt March in 1930. And basically what was happening was Britain had a monopoly on the salt that was sold in India, which is crazy because the Indian Ocean's right there. You have lots of salt of your own. You can make it. But the British taxed the Indian people for their own salt. He thought this was just kind of crazy, which it is. They were the Indian people were even forbid to touch it. So it's a symbol of British oppression. And what he does is he says, okay, I'm going to march to the sea. And again, he was really smart. And I want to bring this point up. He was really smart at bringing the media into it. This is at a point in history where media is really starting to become big. Newspapers, videos, newsreels, things like that. Gandhi was smart in that he's going to get the media involved. He's going to show people really the injustices that were happening in India. And he calls all the other reporters to report on the Salt March, which he took all his followers and 240-mile journey to the sea. And they were just going to make salt, right? And again, it's not necessarily a huge act of protest, but hundreds of thousands of people got into the Salt March, and it was symbolic, right? Gandhi was put in jail because of this, which happened many times in his life, and he was, managed to keep going and keep protesting these injustices. The Salt March was reported around the world. People got outraged. They saw what was happening to the Indian people and really didn't like it, so the world knew about what was going on slowly, and Britain, as a result of that, was forced to give over some power to the Indian people. Eventually World War II happens, 1939 to 1945. Just like a lot of nations, colonies start to become really hard to maintain after the war is over. And this is the case with Great Britain. And so, they're no longer allowed to keep India as a colony. Officially, India gets their independence in 1947. And again, if we're going through this region's process, historical circumstances, why did this happen? I covered that. What are the ideas? Civil disobedience, nonviolence, protesting unjust laws. And then what impact did this have on the country? Well, they got their independence eventually. Gandhi, unfortunately, is not able to see the fruits of this labor. He ends up being, shot by an assassin before he's allowed to see any of the country really come together. And what I mean by that is, when they do get their independence, the Hindus and Muslims there fought over, how should the country be separated, if it should be separated. It ends up being separated. If you've ever heard of the nation of Pakistan, Pakistan and India become two separate nations. It was one, Pakistan becoming prominently Muslim and India Hindu. But Gandhi's influence over the world, is really hard to measure. He's inspired many people to take up nonviolent protest. We're gonna, unfortunately, we won't going to spend a lot of time in class, but we would talk about a lot of nations in Africa around the year 1960 that really copied a lot of his methods of gaining independence from, the mother countries. Obviously, notably, Martin Luther King takes a lot of Gandhi's ideas of nonviolent protests, boycotts, sit-ins, nonviolent protest. And, his idea was that we are fighting here. We may not be fighting with our fists or with guns or anything like that, but we are fighting injustice. And really, that's his legacy going forward. And again, one of the most influential leaders of the 20th century. So I really want to take a full week here and talk about Gandhi. So that's hopefully you get a picture on who he was. I sent out a video on a mini biography last week. Hopefully you can take a look at that. There's a whole 3-hour movie on Gandhi that's really, really good, starring Ben Kingsley. If you're interested in watching that, some parts are a little dry, but really, really good. It shows the Amritsar Massacre, shows the Salt March, shows all the homespun movement and things I just talked about. So If you're interested, take a look at that. And there's some other videos of just clips from that if you want to go online and check those out. But I miss you guys. I really do. I miss being in the classroom. I miss interacting with, all my students on a daily basis. I know this is a tough time, and you guys just got to stay strong, and do what you can at home. Get your routines down. Stay positive mentally, and things are going to get better. It's you might not be the same for a while, but they're going to get better, and we're going to get back to some sort of normalcy. So ask me questions if you need to in the comment section on Google Classroom, and I will talk to you guys soon. Take care. Cheers.